Today in Foundations, we get a new Mythic Dragon enchantment, one of the best cats ever, a new Elenda, and so much more. Let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for one final dose of Foundation spoilers. So we got the full set today, all the rares, all the mythics, check them all out over at MTGpreviews.com, but today we still have some really interesting cards to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Foundations cards. Before we do, some quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. And third, even though we're done with Foundation spoilers, don't worry, there's a ton more Foundations in the future. We'll do podcasts on it, talking about the best cards from the set. Before long, the set will drop on Arena. There'll be tons of gameplay, so keep an eye out for all of that in the future. Anyway, let's talk one last time about Foundation spoilers. So first up today, we get our final mythic of the set in Rite of the Dragoncaller. So Rite of the Dragoncaller, 6 mana red enchantment, simply says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. So Rite of the Dragoncaller compares to Shark Typhoon, Metallurgic Summonings, these enchantments that make creatures whenever you cast a spell. Obviously, there's some twists here. For one thing, Shark Typhoon, Metallurgic Summonings both do more than just make tokens. Metallurgic Summonings can get your spells back from the graveyard. Shark Typhoon honestly gets cycled way more than it gets hard cast. Rite of the Dragoncaller, the only thing it does is make those tokens, but it does have a huge upside, which is Shark Typhoon, Metallurgic Summonings, they make creatures with their size equal to the mana value of the spell that you cast. So if you cast a Brainstorm or a Ponder, some 1 mana spell, you're only making a 1/1. With Rite of the Dragoncaller, every spell's going to be making a 5/5, which means if you can play this and just chain together a bunch of cheap spells, you can make a super huge board of dragons super quickly. So the question is this card actually good? So the upside of this card is we do have the support pieces for it, right? Between Impulses and Might of the Meeks and Burst Lightnings, there's certainly enough cheap cantrip or burn spells that you can play this, untap with it, and make a lethal board all in one turn, which seems pretty powerful. On the other hand, it's very expensive, and I think that's the biggest issue. When I think of slinging spells in Standard, I think of Monastery Swift Spears and Slick Shot Show-Offs and Leyliner Resonances, like these super efficient, low to the ground, cast a bunch of spells, kill you style cards. Rite of the Dragoncaller, just way too much mana for a deck like that, so I'm not sure this actually has a home. The other issue in Standard is because enchantments are really powerful thanks to Duskmourn, and we have all the talents running around, there's just some really good enchantments in Standard, which means most decks are already prepared to deal with enchantments. You get Lost, Tranquil Throwback, Paw Patch Formation, Terra's Under, Nissus, and Animist, so most decks are going to have an answer to this, so I'm just not sure that this is actually going to be a competitive card in Standard. Obviously, if you can stick this and untap with it, you're probably going to be able to win the game within a couple of turns, but are you actually going to be able to do that consistently? Get to 6 mana without being dead, dodge the removal? That's what I'm not actually sure on. On the other hand, I bet this card is going to see a lot of play in Commander. Spellslinger is a really popular archetype, and players love dragons, so this Spellslingery enchantment, that's also going to make a really popular creature type. I imagine we're going to see people playing this in a bunch of different Spellslinger decks. In Commander, ramping up to 6 mana, not a problem. Plus, there's so many strong things going on. I don't know if Rite of the Dragoncaller is going to be the biggest target on the battlefield, but I imagine if you're playing Stellalee or Calamax or Alania, any sort of Spellslinger deck, this is at least in the conversation. The other potential home for this card is in Dragon decks, and I don't know if you can play this in just any Dragon deck, because if I think of like Miram or the Dragon, I'm not sure those decks play enough spells to really make Rite of the Dragoncaller good. But if you're a Dragon deck that also plays a lot of spells, maybe like a Niv Mizzet Perun deck or a Lozin Dragon's Legacy deck, if you're a Spellslingery Dragon deck, then this seems really good, because it does work really well with some of the best Dragon finishers, like Dragon Dragon Tempest, Warstorm Surge, Terror of the Peaks, these cards that deal damage equal to the stats or the power of a creature that comes into play. If you have Rite of the Dragon Crawler and like a Dragon Tempest, you do not need to cast very many spells to just kill your opponent on the spot. So I think there is potential here. Just make sure if you're going to play this in Dragons, that you're a Dragon deck that has enough spells to trigger it consistently. So Rite of the Dragon Caller, it is a big flashy card, and it certainly can win games. Might be a little bit too expensive for Standard, but I do think we'll see it at a minimum in Spellslinger and some Dragon Commander decks. We also got a card that I think almost seems built for Standard, an Elenda Saint of Dusk. So a 4-mana Orzhov 4/4 legendary vampire knight. It has lifelink and hexproof from instants. We also got a card that I think might be pretty good in Standard, an Elenda Saint of Dusk. So Elenda, 4-mana Orzhov 4/4. It's a legendary vampire knight. It is lifelink and hexproof from instants. It says as long as your life total is greater than your starting life total, it gets +1/+1 and has menace. So if you're anything over 20 in Standard, it's a 5/5 menace lifelink for 4. And then if you get above 10 over your starting life total, so up to 30 or more life in Standard, it gets an additional +5/+5. So if you're at 30 or more life, it is a 10/10 lifelink menace hexproof from instants. And I think this card just lines up really well with Standard thanks to hexproof from instants. But before we get to that, I should say a little PSA about this card. The way that damage works in Magic is kind of weird. So let's say you are getting attacked by Elenda and your opponent's at like 18 life and you're like, all right, I'll just block it with a 4/4, trade off, get rid of it. What's going to happen though in combat is the lifelink from Elenda is going to gain the life before it goes to the graveyard, and Elenda's going to see that and grow to a 5/5 if it puts your opponent over 20 life during combat before it dies. So keep that in mind. There's going to be some weird blowouts with this card where someone's at 18 life and attacks and someone doesn't think through how damage actually works and Elenda grows and you lose your creature. Same with the second threshold of getting above 30 life. If your opponent's at like 26 life or 27 life when you attack with this card, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to grow to a 10/10 during combat and potentially blow out your block. So keep that in mind, how the growing actually works. It's kind of like the weird state-based action, lightning bolt at 2/3 Tarmogoyf, and then it grows from the bolt going in the graveyard thing. Sort of like the Standard version of that. So why is Elenda such a good Standard card? And I think it's because it reminds me a lot of a card that was really good in Standard a decade ago, Blood Baron of Vizkopa. So Blood Baron of Vizkopa, a 5-mana 4/4 lifelinker with pro white and black that also grows once you get over 30 life. I feel like Elenda's basically like the 2024 version of this card, and that hexproof from instants is almost as good as protection from white and black. If you look at Standard, because the red decks have so many hasty threats, there's a big incentive to play instant speed removal. So if you look at the most popular removal in the format, you're looking at Go for the Throat, Get Lost, Into the Floodmaw, Soul Partition, Witchstalker Frenzy, Destroy Evil, Tear Asunder, a lot of instants there, and none of these cards can kill Elenda. So there's a pretty good chance in a lot of matchups you just slam this and your opponent isn't going to be able to deal with it with removal, and then if you can gain enough life, you grow into this massive creature. So I think this could be really solid in Standard. It's not to say there's no answers to this. Obviously, like Gix's Command can potentially get it, Sunfall Sweepers get it, Obliterating Bolt, Scorching Shot, Laydown Arms can potentially get it. So there are some answers, but this dodges most of the most popular targeted removal in the format, and it's got a pretty reasonable body. So where do we play Elenda in Standard? And I think there's 3 real possibilities. So one is, it fits really well in the black-white life gain deck. It used to kind of be a bat deck with Zoraline, but it's kind of just evolved into generic life gain shenanigan Orzhov mid-range. This seems perfect there. You have all this life gain stuff to potentially get your life total high enough to make Elenda even bigger, plus it's going to be hard to kill. Could also be a sideboard card for like Esper, Orzhov control style decks, where you bring this in against mono red or decks that just can't kill it, and you have this huge life linking threat that's hopefully going to keep you in the game. Could also show up in some of the legendary decks in some numbers. So I think we will be seeing Elenda in Standard. As far as Commander, that's where I'm kind of meh on this card. Like, it's fine. I guess if I was going to play this in Commander, I would need to be vampires to take advantage of its creature type, and then I would specifically want to be a vampire deck that had life gain synergies. So maybe Sorin of House Markov, Asterion, Lucia, something like that. If I'm vampires and I'm actively trying to gain life, then I think Elenda's pretty solid. On the other hand, in Commander, a lot of sweepers going on, more sweepers, I would say, than instant speed targeted removal. So I think in Commander, it's kind of just okay, while in Standard it can be really great. So Elenda, very interesting card. I expect this to see Standard play just because of Hexproof from Instance, and it can gain a ridiculous amount of life. We also got another loot. Loot Exuberant Explorer. So, Magic Pikachu is now a mono green 3 mana 1/4. It's a legendary beast noble. It says you play an additional land on each of your turns, and you pay 6 mana and tap it to look at the top 6 cards of your library and reveal a creature card with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control to put on the battlefield. The rest go on the bottom in a random order. So, how good is Loot Exuberant Explorer? And I think the answer is, it's fine. Like, Loot is kind of a Wayward Swordtooth or a Dryad of the Ilson Grove, a green 3-drop that lets you make an extra land drop. The twist is, all these cards have an upside. The upside of Swordtooth is it turns into a big creature. Dryad of the Ilson Grove fixes your mana, gives you all land types. Loot's upside is kind of like Kinnon's ability almost, where for 6 mana you can look at the top of your library, hopefully put a creature on the battlefield, and it does reward you for the extra lands it puts into play. So I feel like this is fine. The question in Standard is it better than the other options? So when I think about ramping in Standard, number 1, Overlord of the Hauntwoods is just a busted card. That is ramp spell number 1, not even close. Number 2 is probably Splunking, because having your lands come into play on tap can do some really sweet shenanigans. And then you have a bunch of other options like Heap Harvest, Archdruid's Shard, Return from the Wilds. So where does Loot fit in this? I'm not exactly sure, doubly so since is a 1/4, it dies to cut down, which is very awkward, although it is good at dodging red removal. So we'll have to wait and see. I could see this showing up in some sort of land shenanigan deck, like if you're trying to win with Iridescent Vine Lasher or Lumra combos, just making extra land drops might be good enough that you play this and just go to town, and then eventually maybe you spin the wheel and find a Vine Lash or a Lumra with the second ability. So I think it does have uses, but I think dying to cut down probably makes it more of a fringe card, especially when you consider how much good green ramp we have in the 3-drop slot. It does seem pretty sweet with Splunking. Extra land drops work really well if you're playing like bounce lands like Arid Archway, so I think like the Doppelgang deck we played, I would probably run at least some number of loots, maybe like 2, something like that, on top of the Splunkings, because they do synergize really well together. And then you have the extra ability, it's just kind of a bonus. I've seen some people be like, can't you play this in Coco decks and Pioneer? And I think the answer is actually like a hard no there. Like, sure you could, it is 3 mana, so you can put it into play with Collected Company, but we already have Dryad of the Ilson Grove, we already have Wayward Swordtooth, and those cards don't really see play in Coco decks. The thing about Coco decks is they normally cap out at like 3 mana for their creatures, right? Because you want to be able to hit them with Collected Company. So the second ability on Loot doesn't really do much. If you're paying 6 to get a 3-drop, that's not very good. You're pretty desperate there. And for the same reason, extra land drops just aren't that helpful, and Coco decks tend to be low on lands anyway, so I don't really see the Coco synergy. I do think, though, that people play this in lands decks in Commander. If you're playing like Omnath, Neckerboom, Lord Windgrace, you pretty much want every extra land drop spell that you can get. Plus, in Commander, you're probably going to have some big bomby finishers where you can spin into them with Loot's second ability when you got nothing else going on. So Loot Exuberant Explorer, it seems fine. We'll see where it fits in this standard mix of ramp spells. I will say I think it definitely ranks behind the top tier, but it still might be good enough to see play in certain decks that have a high land count and really care about lands entering the battlefield. Otherwise, a cute new addition for lands decks in Commander. We also got what might be one of the best cats ever printed in Sky Knight Squire. So a 2-mana 1/1 cat scout. It says whenever another creature enters under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and as long as it has 3 or more counters, it is flying and it's a knight in addition to its other types. So this card seems incredibly strong to me. As far as comparisons, it reminds me of like Kazandu Blade Master, Thalia's Lieutenant. These 2-drops, they get a counter whenever a creature comes into play, but there's a huge upside to Sky Knight Squire, which is it doesn't care about creature types. Thalia's Lieutenant only grows from humans. Kazandu Blade Master only grows from allies. Sky Knight Squire grows from any creature. It doesn't even say non-token creature. So you can just play a bunch of tokens, play a bunch of cheap creatures, and grow this really big. And then it gets evasion relatively quickly. Like, it seems very possible to, by turn 3, turn this into like a 4/4 flyer. So I expect this card to be really good in aggro decks and Standard. So it is a cat, so it's worth keeping in mind for cat decks, although oddly, cats in Foundations isn't as heavy on the tokens as I expected. Last time we had cats in Standard, they were almost a token deck. This time, you do have Regal Caracal that makes a couple of tokens, but really, it's not as token heavy as in the past. I think where this will shine the most is really in two archetypes. So one is just straight up token decks. It's almost combos with Hop to It. If you turn 2 Sky Knight Squire, turn 3 Hop to It, you make 3 tokens, that's 3 counters, that's a 4/4 flying Sky Knight Squire, smashing your opponent on turn number 3. Also, we're getting Heroic Reinforcements back, which works really well with tokens, making tokens, pumping your team, giving stuff haste. So I think some sort of token deck, this seems just like a really strong 2-drop. As far as tier homes, I think this also probably fits in the Warden of the Inner Sky decks. We have like Azorius, we have Boros, we have Jeskai. So in those Gleeful Demolition Warden of the Inner Sky decks, this card seems like a great finisher. The only question is, what do you cut from those decks? Can you cut 1-drops? There's not a lot of flex slots, so it's going to be interesting. I think the power level of this card is so high that we will find room for it. I'm not exactly sure what to cut to make it work though, but I think this is a very standard playable card, and it could even show up in token style decks in older formats as well. So Sky Knight Squire, just a really good cat that's going to get really big and super evasive really fast. As far as lower rarity cards, there's one worth shouting out for the memes in Heir Apparent. So Heir Apparent, a 2-mana 2/2 rabbit noble. When it enters, you create a number of 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens equal to the number of creatures you control named Heir Apparent, and then a deck can have any number of cards named Heir Apparent. So Heir Apparent, this is a card that probably won't be good, but it'll probably be the most expensive common in the set. People love there you can play any number of cards. We see it with Slime Against Humanity, Persistent Petitioners, Rat Colony, and Heir Apparent isn't a bad one, right? It's only 2 mana, it makes some extra tokens. If you're gonna overload your deck with one thing, a Grizzly Bears, you could have worse options there. So I don't think this is a competitive card by any stretch, but I do expect this is gonna be like a $2 or $3 common. Plus, it's pretty cute. It combines any number in your deck with a cute rabbit. So I expect we're gonna see this card be a popular janky casual build around. It's also notable because it's the first standard legal, at least, version of a planning number card that's in white. We do have one other white one in Templar Knight, which came in Assassin's Creed, but that one was never legal in standard, and it was in a weird set, and it was uncommon. So I don't know if it really counts, but Heir Apparent is our first in-universe, let's say, standard legal planning number card in white, which is notable. It does the same combos as everything else. Thrumming Stone, cast one of these, and a deck full of them, put them all into play, make a ton of tokens. It's going to be hilarious, but all of these cards kind of do that with Thrumming Stone. So Heir Apparent, not a competitive card, but it is a card worth knowing about, just because if you go to pre-release or crack a box, you're definitely going to want to pull these out, because they always end up being worth a couple of bucks, even though they're just commons. As far as reprints, there's actually a ton, because we have pretty much the whole set now. Go over to MTGPreviews.com, browse through this almost 600 card set, when you include all the side products that are legal in standard, but there's a couple that are worth shouting out. So first off, Rise of the Dark Realms back in standard. It is 9 mana, but it literally just reanimates everything from all graveyards, so it is a pretty epic finisher. I don't know how much this matters for competitive play, but it's at least a solid commander reprint. In standard, we already kind of had this with Awakening Halls, one of the sides of the black mythic room from Duskmourn, although it only hits your graveyard, so you pay 1 more mana for Rise of the Dark Realms, but get your opponent's graveyard too. So we've never really seen this be a competitive card, but I think we will at least see some funny brews around it that are semi-competitive. We also got a couple of more elf reprints. Lathril, the most popular elf commander, probably going to be too slow for standard, and it forces you into black, so I think it's mostly just a sweet reprint for commander, and it'll be cool to have in Brawl. On the other end, Dwyann's Elite, huge deal for standard elves. This is one of the most important support elves, because it just adds 2 elf bodies to the battlefield for 2 mana, so if you're playing a deck full of elf lords, which standard elves almost certainly will be thanks to all these new Foundations editions, it just gives you 2 bodies to pump your Archdruid, to get pumped by your Archdruid, and your Imperius Perfect. So I think we pretty much have the pieces to build the elf deck now. We'll see how good it is, but it actually has a lot of really solid additions. Finally, we got Corsair Captain, a Pirate Lord, a 3-mana 2/2. When it enters, you get a treasure, and then it pumps your pirates +1/+1. How much does this matter for standard? I don't really know. So we've had pirates in the format all the way for a year now, going back to Lost Caverns of Ixalan. We haven't really seen pirates develop into a real deck. I play against it on Arena every once in a while, and it's fine. Does having a 3-mana lord change that? I don't know if that's the problem with Pirates, but it's not going to hurt, right? It is a solid addition to Pirates, so it might be worth revisiting the tribe now that we get this new edition. Anyway, that brings us to the end, not only of our Foundation spoilers for today, but of Foundation spoiler season altogether. So now that you've seen the set, what do you think? Are you buying it? Are you in a pre-release? What are you building with it? I gotta say, this set has me incredibly hyped for Standard. I know that the universe is beyond stuff, 6 sets a year. A little bit nervous about where we're heading next year. There's some stuff that we'll have to wait and see if it works out, if it's good or bad for the format. But I will say, this set looks absolutely amazing. It's huge, it's got a bunch of good cards, it's got a bunch of cool build-arounds, and I think that, at least for the next few months, we are going to be entering into what should be an amazing time for Standard. So I am super hyped to start brewing, and you'll be seeing that in the near future. Even though we're done with spoilers, we'll have podcasts breaking down these cards, gameplay content will be starting soon, streams over on Twitch, so keep an eye out for all that in the future. Thanks for watching today, everyone, and thanks for hanging out for this spoiler season. I know we got off to a slow start because of Vegas. We'll get back to normal next time, but thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the video where we go over the best 300 IQ plays in the history of Magic the Gathering.